Welcome to Swift Coaches Academy, a podcast dedicated to bringing exercise and health professionals the uncensored truth behind what it really takes to succeed in the health industry with me, your host, Zenia Wood. As an accredited exercise physiologist and the founder of Swift Coaches Academy with almost a decade of experience, I'm on a mission to transform the lives of ambitious health professionals who want more and are ready to take action to create incredible impact and financial freedom. So join me as I speak candidly with industry leaders about the struggles and successes from within the trenches through thought-provoking conversations.
Today, Zenia's conversation is with Justin Richardson, physiotherapist and head of rehab at Athletes Authority. After being frustrated with the arbitrary timeframe approach to the ACL Rehab, Justin and the team at AA have created what is fast becoming the new standard in ACL Rehab. Stay tuned for dozens of practical tips any coach can start using to level up their rehab success today.
Mr. ACL, Justin Richards, how are you?
Richardson.
Oh my God, I just saw that. It's written Justin Richards in my notes. My apologies. I know your last name. I just read it as someone else wrote it.
That's all good. And the Mr. ACL bit is a bit flattering. It's I'm someone that has a keen interest in ACLs. It's obviously been an area that as an organization at Athletes Authority, we've had, I would say, the privilege of being able to, I guess, be in the private sector clinical leaders and be at the forefront of clinical practice in terms of being the high volumes of ACL rehab athletes that we look after. So I guess for me, it's an area that I would say that I probably fell into a little bit by accident, but due to the complexity of the condition, the nature of athletes wanting to push themselves and return back to sports, the high variability in the recovery, it's been something that has been a keen interest of mine for quite a while, and something that has evolved in terms of how we approach our rehab structures here at AA.
I love it. It's awesome. And just to backtrack a second, obviously you are the lead head of rehab in terms of ACLs at least, and then I know you have at least a senior role in terms of Athletes Authority's program, and you've been there for a while. Can we backtrack for a second? Because I believe when we spoke about this was something that was born out of COVID. Is that right?
Yeah, it was. So to touch a little bit just on the org structure for a moment. So yeah, my role is the head of rehab, and in particularly now that we've expanded into multiple locations, more specifically the head of rehab in Sydney, in Artarmon, which really sets the forefront for, I guess, all of our innovation for any future facility. As the facility with the most amount of athletes, we get to have the advantage of trialing and testing all of our systems to make sure that they are effective and scalable upon, I guess, a more mass type number of individuals, so that then when we apply them to some of our other facilities, which at the moment we've only got one other, which is in Melbourne, that is at a slightly smaller scale, we're confident that as we implement it, it's going to be quite successful. So where my role really sits in is that I have a heavy focus on the ground in terms of coaching on the gym floor, coaching on the field, being involved in the real nitty-gritty development of the actual rehab systems that go into the programming side of things. And then we've got a great team of physios and S&C coaches that are excellent at executing the programs. They have excellent input in terms of giving feedback back to myself and the higher management team in terms of whatever we need to adjust as we go, as we get more athletes, as our population group changes a little bit. And then above me, we've got our senior management team, which is obviously Kylie, our head of medical services. We've got Lockie, and then we have our head of performance, Tom, in our Sydney facility, and then our head of performance in Melbourne, which is Nathan. So that's a little bit on our org structure. And then to touch on in terms of, well, where did this all come from? And it was originally born out of COVID, in the sense that when the way back in 2020, when we were forced through government regulations to sort of have to shut down, and we ended up stripping our gym and divvying it up amongst the athletes that were with us at the time so they could have home gym packages. I mean, we had a lot of time that we on our hands, apart from a bit of online coaching and things that we needed to do to stay afloat. So we decided that we wanted to develop an overarching system, so a 12-month plus system to guide a specific rehabilitation. And we chose an ACL because it was something that we identified that in the amateur and semi-professional market, which is primarily the population group that we deal with. We've got some like elite athletes, but they tend to be sort of more fly in, fly out. We felt that was done incredibly poorly, and it was one that was incredibly common. The incidence of those injuries were increasing, and the incidence of re-injuries were increasing. So that's why we really honed in on that, and that set the foundations for what is now our sports rehabilitation program, where we've been able to actually use those systems that we built for an ACL injury. And when we opened our rehab program, and we naturally got inquiries for other injuries, whether that be shoulders, whether that be ankles, so we were actually able to apply those systems to those injuries themselves, so we could guide them from their initial stages all the way through to their return to performance. And it was something that I don't think that when we started it, we anticipated that it would grow the way that it was, or that we would get the influx of people that we did. We were naturally confident that it would be something that would really help improve our outcomes, but really the market dictated the success of it for us. And I think that it's a testament to what people in the private sector are looking for, which is not your typical physio model where you just get given a few exercises on a piece of paper and you don't have any structure to your training program, guided from the early stages of rehab all the way back to when you're doing a more athletic development program. So I think it's great that since then more people have attempted to adopt that model, and obviously we've had a number of mentees come under my wing and Carl's wing to really learn about that. But it's been something that has, I can say with the utmost confidence, has been the catalyst for the growth of the business to where we are now.
That's awesome. I think, like from a concept or from a desire of wanting to create better systems in your business to now, obviously you have the ACL mentorship, which is for, health professionals through to strength and conditioning coaches to help them create or effectively like plug and play your system, right? Like, can you talk about, so you created this and then it's obviously iterated along the years to now the ACL mentorship. What exactly is that? What's involved in it?
Yeah, so I think we should probably touch on what exactly were these systems that we developed first. And I think, again, like when we were sitting down and we were designing, well, how do we want this to look? We were really reflecting on, well, what are the challenges of clinicians? And I talk about it a lot where you've got, we'll just lump it in allied health professionals, or people that typically look after early stage rehab on one end of the spectrum, and people that look after late stage rehab on the other end of the spectrum. And there tends to be this gray area where you've got the first 6 to 12 weeks, I would say that majority of allied health professionals are reasonably confident in their ability to, I guess, return an individual to, by and large, normality, where they can understand how to restore range of motion, they can understand how to improve motor control and muscle activation. So an athlete can go from being physically disabled to they're at the stage where they can lift in the gym, they can run somewhat without pain, without increases in swelling, and a moderate level of performance. So that's, you've got one end of the spectrum. Then you've got the other end of the spectrum, which is your late stage rehabbers, your athletic development coaches, which were really confident in being able to design programs around sporting seasons, being able to build out a program for an athlete that's in an off season, building into a general preparation phase, into a specific preparation phase, and then a competition phase. But there's this big gray area in the middle of, if we just use rough timeframes here from sort of your month 3/4 to month 9/10, where there really wasn't anything quantified in terms of, well, how do I actually get the athlete from this stage of where they're not physically disabled, but they're probably somewhat vulnerable to, I don't actually have to worry about this injury anymore. I can plug and place any athlete development type program based on a seasonal cycle, and I know that I'm not going to exacerbate any pre-existing conditions from the injury, or know that I'm also going to continue to improve the deficits that might occur from something like a donor site. So we identified that gap was present, and we were like, well, why has that occurred? And from everything that we can see in the literature is that all the protocols that have been developed historically, whether that be for ACL injuries or other injuries, are typically they're time frame driven, so they're not criteria driven. And then the second part of that is there is very poor structure in terms of mapping out, well, what does an athlete's training week look like? How do I periodize their training intensity? Where am I putting certain exercises in, and what do their training sessions look like? It was purely just, well, from weeks 12 to 16, do these exercises. And it's like, well, for majority of people that have an understanding of exercise science, you'll know that an exercise is purely one variable of training that you can manipulate to get an outcome. So that's where we decided, well, we need to try to fix that. And we started with, well, what are our criteria based on our phases of rehab that we're satisfied that moves an athlete into the next phase, and what does that mean? So an example could be in our load introduction phase. When we move from our load introduction phase to our strength accumulation phase, that's when an athlete returns to run. So we sat down and we decided, well, what's our criteria that we're satisfied with for an athlete to return to run? And we looked at the available evidence. We looked at our experiences with athletes, and we looked at, well, what do we want to see in a perfect world? And then how do we then match that into something that we want to aim to build towards? Now, based off that criteria, that's when we designed our program, our mesocycles, our microcycles, to reflect, well, what are our high training days? What are our low training days? How long is this training block going to go for? As a rough framework. Now, I need to preface it that it is all just a framework, because every human recovers individually. But that's what set aside the system, and we managed to spend 3 months building that out from day 0 to month 12. So we could actually have this framework in front of us as we're guiding an athlete through rehab to know, okay, doesn't matter if I'm in month 4, I'm in month 5, I'm in the load introduction phase, I'm in the training integration phase. Everything is progressed in a steps-like manner. It's based around criteria-based progression that's matched towards appropriate timeframes for expectations, so that we feel confident at all periods of time, the athlete feels confident at all periods of time, so that we know that when they do return to play, that they're going to return to play and have as much risk minimized as possible, but also that they're going to return to play and be performing well. So that's the clinical side of it. And then there's the implementation side of it that we, again, that was probably a bit more of a byproduct that we didn't expect initially, which is how you deliver the service is just as important as what you deliver, in the sense of the coaching element, the access that the athlete gets to you, how we manage to do that in a cost-effective manner that allows the business to stay profitable. So all of those finer details. So that's where we then built out the mentorship program, where we go, okay, we're going to show you how to take the athlete from step 1 to step X, but also we're going to show you how we actually deliver it in a reasonable service model for the private sector. So that's where I would say that the person that, and at least from the first 2 intakes, the person that I've found that benefits from this the most is the practitioner that also either A, is a business owner themselves. So perhaps they're running their own business. They're probably seeing the bulk of the clientele themselves. So they're quite time poor in the sense that they're both working in the business and on the business, or somebody that has a heavy influence over their business structure, because that individual in the mentorship program not only develops excellent clinical confidence, but also has the ability to execute the business systems that we teach. Not to say that your general practitioner doesn't get anything out of it. They still get that massive clinical arm, but they do miss out on that business component.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's really cool to know and to understand, I guess, a little bit more behind the scenes of that. I guess some questions that I think other people might be thinking is, well, you mentioned, it's a framework. Obviously, everyone's individual. So do you go into detail in terms of, do you give example exercise macro, meso, micro cycles, or how much is given and how much is, we still want a little bit of room for critical judgment of what that person needs?
Yeah, so then I think it's important to discuss how things are broken down. So that's where during the course of the program, particularly at the start of the program, we teach our overall systems and principles of rehab that we use across all injuries, in terms of our periodization model, in terms of creating rehab plans, in terms of how we structure our athletes' weeks and the structure and flow of athletes' sessions, so that before we get into any nitty-gritty detail, the person involved knows the ins and outs of how we program. So at the very least, if they weren't to plug and place any of our information, but they were to use our programming systems, they can use their clinical knowledge with our programming systems and they can develop their own programs.
That's awesome.
Then where we go with it is breaking it down into the different phases and I guess the principles to develop clinical reasoning in each phase, because it's important that we don't just say, here's our spreadsheet of what we use, because it doesn't challenge any critical thinking. And at the end of the day, to be able to get optimal outcomes, you need to be a critical thinker to be able to apply the right exercise, the right loading parameters to the right person. Where the framework comes into play is that there are deviations in recovery depending on the graft type that an athlete may have, and the considerations in tissue loading in the program that might need to be considered is important. So we have different protocols or protocol/framework, whatever you want to call it, for a hamstring graft in comparison to a patella tendon graft.
Can I just ask on that, when does that sort of converge and is no longer relevant to the rest of their rehab journey? When do you kind of go, well, it doesn't really matter what graph you had because you're beyond X point?
Yeah, I would say that to be honest, that there actually isn't a point where that doesn't, where it does become completely irrelevant. I think that this is a bit of a fallacy in that rehab space, that, say, for example, if you have your patella tendon harvested, there are long-term changes to that patella tendon that require specific conditioning ongoingly, particularly whilst somebody is trying to have high levels of athletic performance and pursue high levels of training load. Similarly, for an athlete that has a hamstring graft taken, it's an incredibly high grade muscle tendon lesion where there's question marks over the significance of tendon regeneration. So how the body adapts and responds to that in terms of the strategies of muscle recruitment is an ongoing process that the athlete needs to be aware of, stay on top of, not only so they don't start developing pain, but also so they maintain optimal function. In terms of where it becomes not obvious, i.e., somebody walks into the room and they could probably pick from a mile away that person is a hammy graft or patella tendon graft, is more the back ends of your strength accumulation phase into your training integration phase, where it's not like that you have specific prep options for those particular graft tissues. It's just that you might have a program that may be more geared towards hamstring loading versus quad loading.
Gotcha.
So it's those details that become a bit less obvious in the back end of the program, because as an athlete enters training integration, naturally the focus gears a little bit away from the gym. Not that it goes away from that completely, but at the end of the day, we're here to return athletes to sport, not to turn them into powerlifters. So we need to understand that, respect that, and know that by the end of my strength accumulation phase, I need to be incredibly confident that I can return an athlete to team training and start down regulating or turning the temperature down on the oven on their gym work, so that they can perform at team training. So to go then back to the differences in the frameworks, then there's also the element of training age and what are the different progression and regression models that we use in terms of, say, for example, we look at a squat pattern. Well, there's a million different derivatives of a squat. What's the most relevant for an LTAD athlete versus an athlete with a high training age? And then in terms of, well, if I do have an LTAD athlete and I can't, say, for example, barbell squat them, how am I going to get their tissue loading in? How am I going to actually facilitate physiological adaptation to reduce atrophy, increase muscle hypertrophy, increase max strength, knowing that the way that they build strength is different to an adult who has a higher training age. So it's those details. It's then layering in the return to run process as well as any form of off-feet conditioning. That all gets given to the mentees, assuming that they're a premium mentee, at the end of the program. And I think that's very important to acknowledge that that's all at the end, because we have this 3-month journey of development of clinical reasoning, so that they develop their own systems throughout the program.
That's awesome. And so do you facilitate the learning or the creation? Like, are you guys learning together and sort of asking for their ideas as to what they would do in this phase, and then everyone sort of is creating their own thing with your framework? Is that how it works?
Yeah, so it's an interactive platform. Essentially, we have weekly Zoom calls as well as a 24/7 Discord channel, where people come from all ends of the globe, all ends of clinical experience, different backgrounds of being completely private sector. Some have been in pro sport and are now in the private sector. Some are still in pro sport. So in our weekly Zoom sessions, that's where, at least for the sessions that I run, I split the time up 50-50. 50% of the time is structured content delivered by myself, whereas the other 50% of the time is an interactive discussion within the group to make sure that we're breaking down problems and we're getting a full understanding of what the content is and how it can be applied in individual specific circumstances. And that's not just contribution from me, that's contribution from the other mentees as well, based on what they've seen, based on their questions. So I mean, I learn a lot just as much as the mentees learn a lot, because everybody has unique things that they can offer, as well as questions. That's the beautiful thing about teaching, is that you get asked questions that you would never ask yourself, and it challenges you to create a solution for those questions. And then that just continues on the Discord channel, where that is open to anyone at any point in time to just throw rapid fire questions, whether that be clinical, whether that be business related, that you have access to myself, Carl and Lockie, to be able to really troubleshoot any problems that you might have.
That's cool. Can we talk about, like, you've mentioned things like strength accumulation, training integration. What are so those are obviously your phase names. So can we list out what those phases are, and then maybe dive into like an example criteria, because you're saying obviously they're not time-based, which I totally agree with. We need to have, obviously there's going to be some minimum times in terms of post-surgery where you don't want to be doing certain things. But for the most part, once they hit criteria beyond that, it should be based on what they're capable of, rather than I said at 20 weeks you can run even if you're not capable of doing, a single leg sit to stand. So what are the phases? And then maybe give us like an example criteria of how you have decided to help someone tick off that they can move into the next phase.
Yep. No dramas. So our phases of rehab, we have 5 of them. We have our protection, like going from earliest to latest. We have our protection phase, our load introduction phase, our strength accumulation phase, our training integration phase, and our return to performance phase. To give a bit of a macro understanding of what they mean, very outcome focused. So in terms of our protection phase, the outcome is the restoration of tissue physiology, whereas our load introduction phase is to the outcome is that we want to restore local tissue capacity and introduce key lift patterns. So we want to be able to teach people how to move well. Our strength accumulation phase, our outcome is a successful return to run. Our training integration phase, our outcome is a successful return and reintegration to full team training. And then return to performance phase is a successful return to play and being able to quantify and identify what return to performance means for that individual. In terms of criteria, so if we look at, I guess, a common criteria that people are typically after is, when can I say return to run post ACL reconstruction? Is probably one of the most common questions that you'll get. It's probably the second most common question that an athlete will give you outside of when can I return to play. So for us, we look at, well, if our load introduction phase is we want to introduce local tissue capacity and key lift patterns, and we want to build a physical profile that can return to run, we then needed to work out, well, what does a physical profile that can return to run look like? Okay, so then we've got to break it down into, we need to be looking at quadricep strength, hamstring strength, calf strength, dynamic hip, knee, ankle control, plyometric capacity to be able to tolerate ground reaction force. So from there, those tasks, we then break that down into, well, what does that look like? Okay, so from a quadricep strength standpoint, we look at isometric quadricep strength performed in an open chain manner. When I say open chain, obviously the most common is like a knee extension, but it's isometric. We perform it at 90 degrees, so it's completely safe. There's no stress on the graft tissue, and we make comparisons right versus left. Limb symmetry gets a bit of a bad rap because it is titled as something that is obviously very variable dependent on individuals. My take on limb symmetry is that it's only a poor marker if you're crap at training the uninjured side. So as long as you've got a program that can develop strength of the uninjured limb, then limb symmetry should be a reasonable marker, particularly
Yeah, sorry. I was just going to say, with that, in terms of limb symmetry, because I've always thought that can be, if you're testing someone, I don't know, day one, right, and you're looking left versus right, it's like, well, were they just as likely to injure their opposite side? And why would you use, someone's non-injured side if they were just as likely or just as at risk of injuring that side? It just happened that, the other one went first. So obviously you're training both sides as you go through, and we need to make sure it's not these single leg exercises so that they don't progress one-sided and then get even stronger on their, ACL injured side. But what are your thoughts on limb symmetry index in terms of, like, how do you actually use that, and how confident are you that their other side wasn't shit in the first place, I guess?
Yeah, so where I feel that limb symmetry index is useful is in isolated muscle capacity strength measures, utilizing tests where there is an absence of gold standard data. So what I mean by gold standard data is that we know in late stage rehab that we can use isokinetic quadricep strength testing, and it's been very validated, very reliable to identify the percentage of body weight in newtons per kilo that we're targeting for elite athletes all the way down to amateur athletes. So we can get great raw data there. Where we don't have great raw data is using, say, handheld dynamometry, even when you set it up in a way that has great intra-tester, so the one tester, retest reliability, because there's no published data there. So, but we can still use that test to go, right, okay, assuming that I have an athlete that is reasonably trained on the uninjured limb, and even if the uninjured limb has previously had an injury, being able to balance that, because we know that, say, for example, running, locomotion, whilst it is a single leg task, it is a task of transferring weight from one limb to the other limb. And for anyone that has coached running before, if somebody has massive strength asymmetries on one limb to the other limb, they will see discrepancies in somebody's gait and their tolerance of load. So in these isolated strength measures, you can reasonably use limb symmetry index to gauge a marker of progression. It's not an outstanding late stage, and that's why I will never use an isometric knee extension test as a late stage marker of progression. But in terms of gaining one understanding of an athlete's physical profile for their return to run, it's useful. Where you then match that with is, okay, well, what does their isolated knee extension strength look like, and how does that match up with their ability to perform a single leg squat? And not just their ability to perform a quality single leg squat, but also their ability to perform repeated single leg squats. So looking at quantity and quality, because if you get discrepancies in that, i.e. isolated knee extension is good, but they can't perform a single leg squat because they fatigue, then you start raising question marks in your head as to whether they're strong enough to return to run. And that's where all of these criteria, there's no one test that says, yes, you are great to move to the next stage or to do X, Y, and Z. You're just gaining information to make a reasonably informed decision. That's all that it is. So to continue on that path, we've got our quadriceps strength measures, which we've just spoken about, but then also our hamstring strength measures, which we measure at different joint angles utilizing the Nord board. We have our calf strength measures, which we utilize capacity primarily for the calf, given that it's designed to absorb force. It is designed to the calf in itself is designed to promote more endurance rather than power when we run. So they're our primary strength markers. And then in terms of our other measures, it's, well, what does their landing look like in terms of their ability to perform a single leg altitude land and a single leg tall to short? And what does their hip, knee, and ankle alignment look like when they land? What does their triple flexion strategy look like when they land? And there's no way of saying, for me to give a number on this. This is where I think, again, there's another fallacy, is that all criteria need to have a number attached to it. For me, and this probably leads more into our service model in itself, every session that I do with the athlete is a assessment session, because I'm looking at how good are they performing their gait mechanics drills, how well are they performing their strengths exercises, how well are they performing their velocity block, their plyometric exercises. So that's a little bit of a tangent, but we've got the neuromuscular control aspect of how they land, as well as biomechanically how well do they absorb low amplitude plyometrics. So their ability to perform pogo jumps, single leg pogo jumps, alternating pogo jumps. Do they collapse at the ankle and then into knee flexion, or are they really hitting the ground well, producing a lot of force? We can quantify that on the ForceDex. Now, again, we use a lot of the VALD performance metrics to guide our decision making. That's intentional, because we want to be as objective as possible with our progressions, where there are alternatives that you can use via different apps and things like that, but it is something that, I mean, we wanted to create the best framework possible, not people might not have access to this equipment, what do we do then? We go, okay, we can provide some alternatives, but
work backwards from the gold standard.
We're exactly right, working backwards from the gold standard. So I guess to summarize all that, we've got our isolated quadricep strength measures. We've got a more functional quadricep and glute strength measure in our single leg squat. We have our hamstring strength measures through the Nord board, as well as a functional hamstring measure through a single leg hamstring bridge, a single leg calf raise capacity, pogo jumps on the ForceDex, altitude landing control, as well as being able to tolerate well a period of modified surface running. So for us, we're lucky enough to have an Alter G, but for those that don't have an Alter G, our recommendation is using something like a mini tramp, or we've also got an air track where you can train an athlete in dynamic gait drills over a period of time to not only get their body used to hitting the ground, but seeing the quality of their locomotion control.
Is the air track, so obviously the Alter G is the altered gravity treadmill, but is the air track that like curved treadmill? Is that what you're talking about?
No, the air track is just it's like a big air mattress.
Okay. Oh, okay. Gotcha.
It is like a giant air mattress. It's about 15 to 20 meters long, that an athlete can essentially run on or perform drills on, that is a much more friendly surface than the ground.
Yeah, cool. So you mentioned before, obviously, depending on the graft, whether it's tendon or hammy or, there's obviously more than two options now. But if we just say stick to the most common two, are you still setting the same criteria that they need to pass before they move into the next phase, considering that it's not time-based, knowing which graft they have, or do you change when you're expecting them to get to certain markers based on their graft, knowing that one might be behind?
There are deviations, particularly more so early. So in your protection and load introduction phase, i.e. that your expected recovery in your protection phase is slower for somebody with a patellar tendon graft than a hamstring graft. So your benchmarks that you set, say, for example, for quadriceps strength, might be a little bit different in terms of then being able to introduce load for that person with a patellar tendon graft in comparison to a hamstring graft. Similarly, for a hamstring graft, given that we need to allow the hamstring tendon to heal, we're going to understand and set expectations that the hamstring strength is going to be poorer in early stages in comparison to a patellar tendon graft. Similarly, there are some tests that we just say, for example, for a hamstring graft, we'll look at inner range knee flexion via like a kneeling test on the Nord board, so we can get an idea of how strong they are past 90 degrees of knee flexion, whereas that's just not relevant for a patellar tendon graft because we know that they're not going to have that level of morbidity. Where it sort of converges is for any sort of significant milestone, i.e. their return to run or return to team training. We're not going to alter our criteria, say, for example, for quad strength for a patellar tendon graft and lower that because we know that rehab's harder. That would make no sense. It's that we still set the same levels of benchmarks regardless of graft tissue in the later stages because we know that that's when the risk of something bad happening, if we do set lower benchmarks, is going to be higher. The only other exception to all of this would be, say, for example, for an athlete with an allograft, they're not going to have any donor site morbidity. So they are going to functionally fly through the early stages of their rehab. And they will likely hit their benchmarks really, really quickly. That's where timeframes can be helpful because we still need to understand that there are bones, tunnel sites healing. There is a graft site that is undergoing a ligamentization process. So you almost need to intentionally hold them back regardless of them hitting benchmarks, and just educate them on the reasons why.
Yeah, okay. So this might be a bit of a topical question and it depends is probably part of the answer. But if you were to tear your hammy, if you were to tear your ACL, which graft would you get and why? Is there one that you think has better outcomes after seeing hundreds of them, or?
Well, yeah, I mean, the answer is it depends. Now, for me, being a non-athlete,
let's say you wanted to return to sport though, and you did go under the knife, which would you pick?
I think the level of detail on the discussion needs to come down to a couple of things. One is what sport am I playing and what position am I in that sport? I.e., if I'm coming from a jumping sport, like I'm a basketballer, I'm probably going to have a real shitty time if I use a patellar tendon graft because you're going to have patellar tendon changes that are going to not tolerate high levels of jumping load after that. So it's just going to be a much more unfriendly experience. So I'd probably lean towards having a hamstring graft in that case. Whereas if I was like an outside back in a field-based sport and speed was my game-changing quality, then I would probably lean towards having a patellar tendon graft because I wouldn't want my hamstrings compromised. So that's one layer to it. The other layer to it is what is your prior morbidity and morphology look like that might implicate it. Like if you've had a number of hamstring tears and your hamstring tendons aren't necessarily that outstanding in terms of collagen type or in terms of thickness of tendon, then you may not want to use your hamstrings for the graft. Or if you've had a lot of patellar tendon problems, or say if you've been somebody that historically has suffered from anterior knee pain, whether that be patellofemoral joint pain or patellar tendon pain, then a patellar tendon graft might not be the best idea for you, because you're going to be at a higher risk of having anterior knee pain during rehab, which is going to halt your progress. So I think they're the questions that you need to ask yourself, because when we look at graft strength and re-rupture rates, there's probably, and I say probably because it's not definitively confirmed, but there is a tendency to suggest that a patellar tendon graft is the strongest. I wouldn't say that is by any significant margin, but it is by some margin. The weakest would be an allograft, but again, not so significant that it's never used. Hamstring sits somewhere in the middle. Again, in terms of re-rupture rates, the addition of a lateral tenodesis decreases graft failure rate and re-rupture rate in comparison to not using one, but that there's no such thing as a free lunch. So it's understanding, well, is that going to be of benefit to you or not? And that's dependent on the level of sport, the amount of hypermobility, the amount of risk factors in your family. Like, there's a lot of questions that you need to ask, which comes back to, I guess, if it was me, and again, I know it's like if you're trying to return to sport, but for me, like as the reasonable non-athlete still playing some sport, but not really my major focus, I would probably go with something like an allograft, because it would give me some level of stability. I'd keep my hamstring and patellar tendon, but it's not something that I would anticipate to put a ridiculous amount of load under, which it's like anything, right? The more times you put yourself in a risky situation, the more likely chance something is going to happen. Whereas if I'm doing one training session a week and playing my sport on a Saturday, then that's less risk than someone that's training 3 or 4 times a week and playing at a semi-professional, professional level, which is why majority of them would get a patellar tendon or a hamstring tendon graft.
Yeah, cool. No, I love that answer, and I really appreciate the thoroughness to it, because as soon as you said that, I was like, oh, well, I played volleyball, basketball growing up. Like, my right patellar tendon has tendinopathy in it, and so that would be a bad idea for me to do that. So, I do love being fast as well, so I wouldn't want, ideally in a ideal world, you don't want any of it, but I think that those answers hopefully would be very helpful for navigating conversations, whether with clients or, with friends or family who may have had that happen. Obviously, understanding that you want to get a professional's advice on what's actually going on with you, and not just jump to, what you heard in a podcast.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you think would be super relevant or helpful for people to know about rehabbing ACLs, creating program structure, or the mentorship specifically?
I think probably the thing to finish on would be touching on the service delivery, because it's something that, again, I mentioned it before, it's an area where I didn't anticipate it to be as powerful as it is, in the sense that you don't know like how effective or ineffective your program is until you've seen your athlete execute it. And you could have everything right on the program, but if they perform it poorly, it could exacerbate any pain. It could mean that they're not getting the strength gains that they need to get, and it can leave you scratching your head as to why that's happening. So I think in terms of what makes our rehab program so powerful is our ability to create an environment where your allied health professional and your strength and conditioning coach is on the gym floor with the athlete from day one until the day that they return and beyond that, as well as being able to have an environment where you can be really agile to making changes to programs, being able to see an athlete whenever they need to be seen, being able to create a community amongst athletes. So you could have a room filled with ACL rehabbing athletes, helping each other, discussing their different phases of recovery, being able to provide tips for them, so that you create this real sense of community, which is something that is not commonly experienced in rehab. Rehab's a pretty lonely place most of the time, and it's even more lonely if you're just given a sheet of paper or an online program from your physio and you're just expected to do it yourself. So that applies to the gym as well as the field work. Like, I've learned more about rehabbing ACLs by being on the gym floor and being at the field than I have from reading any research paper, because it's not what you do, it's how you do it. And I think that's probably the most powerful component of the mentorship program, is being able to facilitate that service model and get clinicians away from the shackles of session by session type physiotherapy, which is proving to be very ineffective for complex sporting injuries. And there have been some absolute like transformations in businesses and outcomes that we've had thus far with people that have just taken on board this model, adopted it, and not only are they more profitable than ever, but their job satisfaction and their business satisfaction is far higher than they could ever imagine. And that's what gives me the most satisfaction out of this program, is being able to help other people help hundreds of other people.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I love that. So before we get into dates of ACL mentorship and where we can sign up to that, what I'd love to go through is what we usually finish with is something actionable that the coaches, allied health pros listening can start to implement immediately that will create some meaningful change. So whether that's around systems or programming or the ACL specifically, do you have something that you feel like would be a great actionable strategy that people can start using now?
Yeah, so as simple as it sounds, particularly if you're a professional that doesn't have the privilege of being able to spend time with the athlete on the gym floor or the field, is if you're not already getting them to send you videos of them performing their program, then you absolutely need to get that done, as well as having a way of quantifying the load that they perform, so that you can understand qualitatively how they're moving, as well as quantitatively, I guess, what their rate of perceived exertion or their level of exertion is during their program. And I think that can apply across all injuries, not just ACLs, because if I was to just say, yeah, do this exercise, or like this test is great, then it would be great for some people, but it wouldn't be great for others. Whereas this has been one of the biggest game changers, particularly as our program has scaled so much to the point where I'll actually not be on the gym floor with my athletes most of the time, because we have so many athletes and so many sessions. Now, our program's grown to the point where it's got over 100 rehabbing athletes, which is not the aspirations of most people that enter, say, the mentorship program. They just want a humming rehab program where they could maybe have 30 people in it, which is very manageable by one person, and that's enough, and that's totally fine, because then you get to spend all the time with them, and that's when things are the most rewarding. But if you're currently in a setting where you don't get to see how an athlete performs their rehab program, you need to change that, because it'll change immediately how you program.
Awesome. That's awesome. Okay, and then lastly, people who are frothing at the mouth with what you've just said about the ACL mentorship and want to sign up or want to learn more, where can they find that?
So all the information for the program is on our webpage, and it might be useful if
we'll link that.
If that just goes in the show notes. So that has all the information about what's involved, costings, and any kind of links for inquiries. So the program commences on the 16th of May. It's run entirely online, so it can be done by anyone around the world, whether you're in Australia, whether you're overseas. Time zonings are typically friendly for people in Australia as well as people in Europe, but all sessions are recorded, as well as having a 24/7 Discord channel. So if there are sessions that you need to miss, then that's totally okay. We can always catch up on that later.
Awesome. And then where can people find you specifically?
Primarily on on Instagram. That's where I spend most of my time. So Instagram handle is just jrehab_. Otherwise, my email, so always available via email, which is just justin.richardson@athletesauthority.com.au.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you so much for jumping on and giving us heaps and heaps to take away for ACLs and programming in general. I think that this will be one for the books, as for people who want to bookmark it and come back to it later, because I don't know if I took everything in the first time around. We might need to go back and do it again. Thank you so much, Justin.
No dramas, and it's been a pleasure.
Thanks. See ya. If you enjoyed this episode, it'd honestly mean the world to us if you could share it with a friend or on your socials, follow and leave a quick review so that we can bring you more real, raw and uncensored stories from industry leaders. We also love hearing your feedback, so please DM us on Instagram @SwiftCoachesAcademy if you have suggestions for future guests or topics. Until next time, and in whatever you do, move swiftly.